On, I haven't switched on. Good morning, everybody. I have a clock in front of me that says 10:35. It's 5 minutes fast. The time now is 10:30. Welcome to this first meeting of the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority here in Room X. Behind me, cordoned off, is Room Y. If we had a large meeting with a lot of members of the public wanting to attend, well, we could take this partition down, as indeed we will do, for celebrating success and other big events that may happen here. So I think we're all quite excited to be here today. This is, as I understand, the first time any meeting has taken place in this room. So any feedback that you may have about the facilities, I think will be usefully received. I'm speaking to you on this brand new microphone that I've been told is new. And as your chairman, I've got this little button here that will cut you off if I want to do that. You haven't got one. No, I don't think you can. But I welcome your participation in the meeting. So anyway, we've started the meeting, so I need to say that this meeting is being recorded for broadcast on the authority's website and will be available for repeated viewing. The press and members of the public are also permitted to film and broadcast this meeting. Those remaining at the meeting are consenting to being filmed and recorded, and to the possible use of those images and recording for broadcast purposes. The fire exit is over in the corner over that way, although it doesn't say on that door there, but there's a fire exit out that way as well. I think we can exit this room fairly quickly if we need to. There will be a scheduled fire alarm test at 11:30 this morning. This, I'm told, will last no longer than 1 minute, and we will remain in this room during that time unless we hear otherwise. I've told you about the microphones, and you push the button in the centre there to speak. Please pull them in close so we can all hear what you're saying. Please disable your mobile phones, as I'm now doing. I think that covers all announcements, so we can now go to your agendas, please, and take item 1, which is apologies for absence. I have apologies from member Councillor Jeff Hockley. Jeff, as you may know, is ill with a heart condition for which he awaits an operation. Unfortunately, he's had an accident also and fallen, and he's got, as I understand it, significant injury, which he's still recovering from. But he's hopeful of being able to join us next week for the extraordinary standards and governance meeting. So that's Jeff. And we also have apologies from PCC Michael Lane, who, as I understand it, is not well at this time. That's item 1. Item 2 is declarations of interest. I think you're all familiar with that. Anybody has any declaration that they feel they need to announce at this time, will do so, or if it comes up during the meeting, will let us know about that.
Mr. Chairman, I assume we've all been given a dispensation to vote on the council tax?
Oh, yes, I think that is. Thank you for raising that. Yes, I think that's taken as read. Item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Please turn to page 5 of your agenda. So taking those for accuracy. Page 5, page 6, 7, 8. Oh, that's the that is the end of that. So everybody content that that is a true record of the meeting that was held on the 24th of January? Agreed? Right. Matters arising, I will ask Paul Hodgson for an update on item 154, please, on page 6.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, obviously, you will recall that yourselves and your colleagues on the Isle of Wight made the decision to proceed with the submission of a proposal to create a new combined fire authority and delegated to officers the preparation and submission. As part of that project and the governance around it, officers would invite you to form a member working group to assist in that process and to provide a steer to officers before the shadow authority comes into being, which, if it all goes ahead, would be later in the year. So, as a matter arising on that item, we'd suggest that a member working groups formed effectively of all members of Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority plus the cabinet member on the Isle of Wight, and if you content and agree to that, delegate to the chief officer to put the arrangements in place for that. We will probably bring an update back to the next authority on terms of reference, etc.
Right, thank you for that, Paul. So I'll just move back to item 152 for an update from the Chief Fire Officer.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, for your awareness, it was announced the appointment of Steve Apter joining us as our Deputy Chief Fire Officer as and when Andy Bowers retires. I'm delighted to say we've managed to negotiate a handover period with London Fire Brigade for Steve to arrive earlier, so we've got a crossover period. He'll be arriving here at 14th of April is intended start date, so which is great news for us. We're able to get a decent handover for a really important role, so I'm sure you'll be delighted to welcome him when he arrives here.
Thank you. I think that completes the minutes then with matters arising. So now we move to item 4, deputations. We have none. Item 5, Chairman's announcements, just one or two here. So following the meeting of the authority in the Isle of Wight Cabinet on 24th of January, the authority and the Isle of Wight Cabinet, or Isle of Wight Council, have unanimously voted in favour of forming a new authority covering Hampshire, Isle of Wight, Southampton and Portsmouth. This is what you've just heard. Work will continue to deliver appropriate documentation for Home Office submission. Recruitment campaign, whole-time firefighters. Since the start of the year, the Fire and Rescue Service have run 14 have-a-go days at 9 stations across the county. The days targeted potential recruits and nearly 200 people took part. They experienced many areas of firefighting, including BA use, ladder climbing and fitness tests. So thanks go to everybody who helped to arrange and deliver those days. It was a great team effort to engage with potential recruits, which has led to 795 submissions. That's really very high. We had a significant increase in our application rate from groups that are underrepresented in our organisation. Is there anything else you want to add to that at this stage?
Just my thanks to the team. I think, absolutely, as members will be aware, we're focusing on parts of our communities that we don't represent well, and we will. I'd like to come back on at least. We are delighted to see so many of those groups come through this process. Now, clearly, there's still tests to go through, and we'll continue to actively support underrepresented groups to make sure we get a balanced workforce in the future. So I'm delighted, and my thanks to the team who've done so well at attracting those people to us.
Thank you.
It does not go out because there's nobody of any importance.
Well, maybe, because nobody was moving or waving their arms about. So that needs me to then say, thank you for that, Jonathan, On behalf of the authority, I would like to thank all the teams involved in the construction and finalising of these fantastic facilities. Clearly, we need to think about the lights, and yeah, we don't want the light. As I said earlier, we are the guinea pigs here, and we will be hoping to sort of let these rooms out to other organisations. Clearly, we don't want the lights to go out when they're just starting their meeting. So that's something that needs to be looked at. This goes on. The facilities and technologies available will future-proof Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service and Hampshire Constabulary and provide increased opportunity to strengthen our collaborative working. So there we are. I'm sure they'll investigate that. And what I should have said to you is you've got a hard copy agenda, but it's on mod.gov, but there's a different Wi-Fi password for this specific room as against elsewhere in the building. I hope you've already got that, and I hope that that is something that can be investigated, and indeed in the wider context, already elsewhere in this building, the Wi-Fi doesn't always seem to work, does it? So I would hope that that was something that can be investigated. So moving on, you will all be aware that there was a significant fire in Andover just recently. So I'd like to praise all those from the service and other blue light and supporting services who took part in that incident. And I'd like to thank them all for their focus and dedication through that incident, which was indeed very dangerous. And I think you'd all agree with me that this has demonstrated our public service ethos that drives our team to make life safer for the communities of Hampshire. I'll now hand over to the Chief Officer, who will tell you a little bit more about those events.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for those kind words of support. Members, as you'd imagine, a fire of that significance and size did stretch us as a service. We are a large service compared to many, and we relied on help from a number of surrounding counties and beyond. So my thanks and praise go to the team, all the people that were involved in that incident. We had firefighters from just about everywhere in the county. Clearly some had to still provide cover across the county while that fire was going on. But the fire itself is a great deal to be learnt from a fire of this magnitude. And for a fire and rescue service, it's deeply frustrating to deal with a fire of that size because you simply don't have enough water to deal with a fire when it reaches that size. Its growth, its sudden growth, its size it got to, and the hazards that were involved in that particular building require some understanding. Not only for us as a fire and rescue service, but indeed the company itself, and indeed the international fire community. And already we're seeing a great deal of interest being gained by international communities wanting to know how that fire spread like it did, and the building construction, the nature of those buildings. So clearly, in today's session, I can't go into too much detail around that, but to say that in order to understand those things that occurred, it's important we have a post-incident review, and a thorough post-incident review supported by various agencies in the fire sector. So whilst pleasingly, no loss of life, and our firefighters all emerged unscathed, although some were taken to hospital for precautionary checks. It's important for us to remember that these fires could so easily take lives, could so easily injure firefighters, and so I'm determined to understand the entire life of this fire, how it grew, how it continued to thrive, and how the various hazards that were incorporated during that firefighting operation were understood. Not only because I can make sure my teams are safer still, but also I can ensure that the rest of the British Fire and Rescue Service, and indeed the UK Fire and Rescue, the global Fire and Rescue Service, remains safe when fighting fires of this type. So I've asked ACO Shantha Dickinson, who looks after our performance and assurance for the organisation, to lead a piece of work which will look into a number of factors, which I'll go into some details a bit later on, to make sure that we understand those issues, not just for us, as I make that point earlier, but for the wider global community. I'll speak some more in agenda item 7 under the budget issue to make sure I can explain the details in which we require to go through that, which will require funding for us to undertake. But I do not want to escape the fact that our teams across that 48-hour, maybe longer, 60-hour period, there were absolutely some acts of heroism. There were absolutely some acts of selflessness, and there will be a thorough understanding about those individuals that went above and beyond in terms of the duties on that evening and over that period. Equally, there are some commanders that had to make some tough decisions in that time, and today are still reflecting and focusing on that role. This incident has hit this organisation very hard, despite the fact that no one was hurt, which is excellent news. People had to take some very difficult decisions over that period. So we will reflect on those, we'll consider those, and we'll praise and celebrate those things that went very well, and we'll learn from those things that we look more closely at and say, could we have done that better? There's always opportunities to learn. That's not code for things went wrong here. The fire burnt for a long time, but I have to say, I've got nothing but praise for my teams across Hampshire and for those services that came to our aid over that period. There were Kent, Hertfordshire, Surrey, Dorset, Wiltshire, and there's a number of services further afield than that came to our aid in terms of their specialist equipment and support in that operation through those 2 nights. So we're now repatriating equipment. As you can imagine, we lost some equipment in that incident, and that will be replaced by the normal procedures of insurance. And we will look to restore all of our fire engines to their former glory. I'm pleased to say that there was nothing significant in terms of high value lost in that fire to the Fire and Rescue Service. But the most important factor was our staff came through unscathed and with nothing but experience under their belts to come to show for it. So thank you for the opportunity to praise my staff some more, and I'll talk some more to the piece around the budget report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I think when it is appropriate, I think the members would probably appreciate a more detailed, perhaps confidential briefing on what happened there. But we'll await your guidance on that. Right, thank you. So we move on to item 6 then. Member development and comments. Opportunity for those of you that may have been somewhere for some training or briefing session to impart your knowledge to us.
Chairman, I had a meeting last week with Shantha and Jason Avery and Dave Turner and Molly on the performance management issues. And I've got another meeting in April with Hazel Anderson Turner.
Thank you. I think Roger was first. I'll come to you in a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had an email back on the 13th of February from the Local Government Association about LGA Leadership Essentials in Fire and Rescue Authorities. Now, this is a course which is out to Warwick University and is free, and the fire service gets this because we are members of the LGA. The LGA pays for the whole course. I'm not sure whether you also received a copy of this email, Chairman, but I think that it is something which is very worthwhile going to for any member of the Fire Authority. Unfortunately, this one is very late notice and came in on the 13th to the 27th, 26th and 27th of February. But I think it's something which we ought to make sure that members are aware of, and if anybody, although there is a meeting on next week, who wants to go to it, and if there are spaces, has the ability to go or the opportunity to go. But I think it's something which we need to take up with the LGA, is that we need much more notice than just 2 weeks of when a course is taking place, and to see if they are running any others this year, because it is worthwhile for members to go to. The other point that...
Comment on that. Yes, we did receive notification of that, and it's far too late, as you said. Yeah.
The other one is that I did attend, or was asked to attend on behalf of the LGA, a spending review of finances at the Home Office. I was asked to go as a member of my political party. All 3 political parties were represented, and I think it was very interesting to note of where the finances and where the Home Office is looking at on spending reviews for the future. I think the biggest difficulty is probably going to be is that they're not sure, because I think the Home Office and government has other things, other pressures at the moment, and people have been seconded from one department to another. And I think that there may be only a 1-year review rather than the 4 years which was originally expected, or it may be a 3 or 4 year. Nobody really knows at the moment, so it's very much in abeyance. The two issues which I actually asked them to take on board is, one is the major issue of pensions, which is the Home Office is going to fund this year the pensions extra liability to us, but there is no commitment to fund it beyond this year, and I've asked that that should be taken into consideration. And the other one was to do with supplying emergency services or setting up and national resilience, is that where national resilience is set up is that the service should be actually funded from central government rather than actually have to fund it itself. They've taken it on board. Whether it gets anywhere or not, you know, time will tell.
Okay, thank you for that. Jonathan, yes.
I just wanted to say that there was a fire which was dealt with by our fire service, Lyde Green near Rotherwick, near Hook, recently, dealing with quite a large house. Quite a number of fire engines turned up. Most of the firefighters were there for most of the afternoon and ably dealt with the fire. I wanted to congratulate them. It was close to where I live, that's the principal reason. And of course, we didn't hear very much about it because immediately afterwards the Al-Qaeda fire took place, and everything else basically was basically took second place. But thank you to all the firefighters.
Yes, thank you for raising that, Jonathan, because whilst the Al-Qaeda fire was taking place, there were other fires occurring down here in Southampton, weren't there? I think there were at least 2 significant fires down here. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that and it emphasises the control aspect of the fire service and how important they are in the deployment of assets and firefighters. Right, thank you. Anybody got any other points they wish to bring up? Oh, sorry, David, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, our communities really appreciate excuse me, our on-call firefighters, and I'm delighted to say that on Wednesday, one parish council will be giving a couple of awards out to firefighters in Hartley Witney. So, what can you sort of tell us a bit more? What award? They are civic awards award given by the parish council, and I can't say too much more because not everybody that's receiving the award knows. So yes, it's just one of those things which I think is rather nice for appreciation to be shown to the on-call firefighters, and Hartley Witney is doing so.
Excellent. This is about engagement in the local community, presumably, is it? Oh well, that's good. Are we aware of that? Yeah.
But thank you. I think it's a great example of where members can really assist in that local engagement for our teams, and recognition is always welcome. And certainly we do our best centrally to recognise those going the extra mile to provide cover, particularly during the recent busy period. So many fire stations got themselves stood up and kept themselves available over that period to make sure we had resources. So I think it's an excellent time to reward and recognise them.
The decision was only made last week, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, good.
I'd like to thank Councillor Simpson for mentioning this. Since the parish council meetings are public meetings, could he please now let me know what time and when this is happening? When is this happening, this parish council meeting?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, it's a special event that will be held on Monday, and it's invitation only. but it's at the Victoria Halls on Monday evening at 7 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Talk to the clerk.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I will.
That's. I think that's an area where I can use my button here, because this is something for the north of the county to deal with privately. Okay. Has everybody said all they need to say there? Anybody got anything else? No? Good. Thank you for that. And so we now move on to the first main item on our agenda item 7. Budget and precept requirements, year 2019-20. Please turn to page 9 of your agenda. Can I just also make sure that you have the amended Appendix B, and you also have the additional Appendix 1 background paper, Acado Fire. You've already got those papers? Good, thank you. So I'll now then hand over to Rob Carr, please, to introduce his report. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, members. Just take you through a few bits in the report, if I may. If I can ask you to go to paragraph 12. So just in terms of an update on budget monitoring for Q3, so we're now looking at a forecast underspend of £2.6 million, which will obviously give us a very welcome boost to the transformation reserve. Main area of underspend is within employee costs, mainly down to 3 areas. Firstly, pay awards, which we had allowed for, were less than anticipated. We've taken out some early savings as part of the service delivery redesign review, which have come out during the year, and also we've had general vacancies throughout the year, which have contributed to that position. Some of the other overspends within some of the other headings have been reported throughout the year, and most of those have been fixed as part of the 2019-20 budget setting, the zero-based budgeting review that we did. Paragraph 16 just shows you the relative impact of changes in council tax. So we've put this in previous years just to show the relatively small impact that the Fire Authority increase in precept has on council tax overall. I do have to say this year, to being a little bit jealous about the Police and Crime Commissioner, if we were allowed a £24 one-off precept increase, that would give us an extra £10 million recurring a year. So I think that's perhaps one we need to lobby for the future. So one of those would be good for us. Paragraph 37. So this is the table that we put in every year, and effectively shows that once again we've managed to move from a predicted gap of £700,000 in the medium-term financial plan to a surplus in the year now predicted at £1.2 million, which will contribute to the transformation reserve. So I won't apologise for it being that way round every year. We do budget prudently. In fact, we've been less prudent than we have in previous years, but we're still coming out on the very positive side. Just a couple of things to pick out from that table. So again, at the top, we've got early delivery of SDR savings ahead of the expected plan. So that has added £600,000 to the surplus. And then a bit of a strange one near the bottom, increase in Section 31 grant. So you'll be aware that the government provides different discretions and exemptions for business rates, which they often announce in the budget to obviously try and help different elements of business. What happens is they give a Section 31 grant to compensate for the lost retained business rates that we otherwise would have got. What they're not very clear on is how long those will last. So ones that were given, say, 5 years ago may have already dropped out. Others have dropped out in a shorter time frame. So we make no real big assumptions about which of those exemptions and discounts will continue. And this year they've been particularly generous, and we've got an extra £725,000 worth of Section 31 grant. So those two things between them pretty much make up that surplus that we've got in the budget for 1920. Paragraph 44, so Chairman's referred to the fact that we've got a revised Appendix B in terms of our reserves position, so apologies for that error in the original papers. But again, our current reserves are looking healthy at the moment. Paragraph 50, so we normally produce the Treasury Management Strategy Statement, which I know is everybody's favourite, as I say, every year. That's in Appendix F. This year, under the code, we've also got to produce a capital and investment strategy, which has been produced for you at Appendix G. So I think this is the first time that we've produced these two in this format, and I think there are some overlaps and some duplication within those. So we'll review those next year to try and make them fit together a bit better. But that's a new requirement in order to make sure that we comply with the code this year. Paragraph 56. So as part of setting the budget, I, as your Chief Financial Officer, am required to give what's called a Section 25 report as part of the Local Government Act 2003. In past budgets papers, I've tended to do this within the main body of the report and just given a few paragraphs just to say that I'm comfortable with the adequacy of reserves and the robustness of the estimates. Given the enhanced concentration on local government finances these days, I've done a slightly larger report which is attached to Appendix H, and you should take that, what I've said in those, into account when you come to set the budget and the precept. The recommendations are before you from 75 to 87, but as mentioned before, we do have an extra recommendation to add, which Neil will now pick up.
Recommendation 88, which comes after the recommendations you've got on page 21, and I'll now ask the Chief Officer to speak specifically on that additional recommendation.
Thank you, Chairman. So, members, as I introduced the Ocado fire, the background paper produced today, and hopefully you'll appreciate the nature of the urgency here, and hence being a background paper to consider. I do lay out the operational context in which we faced at that fire, and also the impact of evacuating potentially at one point 6,000 people from the surrounding area. Now, we didn't have to do that far in the end, but it was certainly a work-up that evening to consider that situation, which would have been a significant impact. As it was, there are about 20 families affected directly, which was an impact for them, and continues to be an impact for the surrounding industrial estate. So the review itself, what we'll try to do is outline what we are focusing on the particular gathering, but just in some sense of understanding why we need to spend this money. When you consider we now are fortunate we have body-worn cameras on our officers, we have process or digital logging processes on our command units. So there's a great deal of data, hundreds of hours of video to go through to consider what was seen. Equally, we've got cameras on the incident ground itself from either individuals or from other agencies, police included, which would serve to give us good evidence and good data of what was happening in that fire. What we do know is that the fire moved from a relatively controlled state, although difficult to attack because it was within the racking system, to a very rapidly growing dangerous fire. And we had to evacuate our staff from the roof very, very quickly. And that was the moment where we had a number of very brave acts to make sure all colleagues got off that roof in time. So that was unplanned and was not considered to be likely at that time. So that's something I really want to understand. So to understand what was happening before, during and after that sudden fire growth, it's really important that we get into the science by remodelling, by using our own engineers to remodel, by using other agencies like BRE, the Building Research Establishment, by using overseas facilities to assist us understand that built environment. So there's a great deal of work to do over a period of time. Now, I don't envisage that it will go on past 6 months' piece of work. That's the kind of target date for ACO Dickinson to consider. But that said, if during that journey there is we uncover some other issues, then clearly it may need to extend. So the costings we've provided really do focus on that sort of estimate, albeit they're allowing us space in which to continue should we need to. So I've logged down the sort of things that we'll be looking at, taking statements, gathering body-worn camera footage, logging the incident as it unfolded, understanding the complexities and challenges associated with these types of building construction. Very unusual. It's only one type of construction like this in the world, and is something which they are keen to understand the impact of this construction too. And also it will influence national operating guidance and indeed probably building regulations. So it has a standing and interest from the fire sector that it may even start to influence building regulations themselves. So a lot of really high-level interest in what happened at this fire, which I'm keen to service, as I said earlier, to make sure not only our staff are safe, but buildings like this, when they're built in the future, continue to be improved and become even safer and more effective for the companies involved as well as their surrounding neighbourhood. So the financial resources we've described, and I appreciate that on the face of it, arguably could fall within my delegated authority to assign that money, but I wanted to bring it here so that you were aware of the scale of this piece of review, so that we gather the right information for the right reasons. So the people there really take the weight off, because ACO Dickinson has got the challenge of creating a new department for our organisation. The review and assurance and performance particularly are a new concept for the organisation at this level. HMI has looked very carefully at our evaluation, so it's a big job on without this fire, and so giving her the capacity to continue to do that job, allowing someone else, another team within but below her, to go and get this important work done, which will inform her role, I think is very, very important. So that's why the resources are being requested for the budget, and hopefully that is understood by members. But I'll happily take some questions around that point at the appropriate time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for that. Members, I know you've got some questions on the whole report, but we'll just take specific questions on that area now. We'll take those first of all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Neil, is what I don't understand on the financial resources is that the three top ones, which is an area manager, group manager and station manager, we are already paying for because they're already in service. So why is the recommendation to take that amount of money from the transformation reserve because they're already being paid for? I accept that you may need a couple of extra administrators, you may have to employ them outside, so that could be an extra cost, and I accept specialist advice and contingency is an extra cost. I understand that. So in my mind, the extra cost should be 44,000, not the 160. And I just want to understand that, because to me it would be vying, which, as Neil said, he has the authority to vie money up to certain levels from one heading to another heading, and I would have thought it's vying money rather than actually extra money.
No, it's a fair question, but I'll make the point. We have the point I made earlier about the business as usual. So we have, as it stands, a substantive footprint of 4 area managers doing their day job. In fact, we currently have 5 because we have a temporary role doing a particular task. So because they're doing their job, and indeed I mentioned ACO Dickinson's challenging period now of focusing on getting that part of the directorate up and running with the help of Member Champion. So that's an ongoing day job. You add then an Ocado fire to this, which needs strategic guidance in terms of the areas it looks at, the partnerships it makes across the globe to make sure it's done thoroughly and well. So this area manager, the area manager described in this paper, is a new area manager post, albeit a temporary area manager post, that won't be associated with daily work. So it's an addition. That's why it's a new cost. That's why it comes out of the transformational reserve. So it won't be a permanent budget uplift. It'll be a one-off payment to cover the period I talked about the length of this review. And the same is true for the group manager and the station manager and administrators. They're new roles which will be outside our business as usual, which need to be funded separately from our core budget.
Come back slightly on that. If the area manager, group manager, station manager is coming from within the service at a lower level than what they are at that rank, surely part of their cost is also, again, already in the budget. So that's what I'm just grasping to understand, is when part of the cost is in the budget, why do you want the extra money?
No, sure.
If you're applying them from outside, I can understand.
No. But you see, right at the end of that scale, this is the trouble we have with temporary posts. if we replace that area manager with a current group manager, we'd have to replace that group manager with the current station manager. That all knocks down all the way down the chain, which Molly will tell us, to a firefighter, and we'll have to bring in a temporary firefighter, which would probably be an RDS firefighter on a temporary contract. So that's how we operate all the way through our chains. So we end up with a number of temporary chains, which aren't always helpful. That's why we're really clear about we must need that post in the first place and be really clear about what it's doing, because it causes knock-on in the organisation. So the new cost, if you like, is right at the top, which is the extra post you're putting in, and there'll be a temporary firefighter right at the end as well.
Thank you for that. I think we need to recognise that this was a multi-million-pound fire, which is going to have international repercussions, and it is absolutely vital that we get on with our investigation. The fire service here in Hampshire gets on with the investigation as soon as it possibly can. So personally, I don't think the sum of £160,000 is really a significant amount, and I hope you'll agree that we want the chief officer to instigate the inquiry just as quickly as he can. Anybody got any other comment on this specific issue?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make it quite clear is that you having said what you've just said, I'm not against what is being done. I want to see it done. I totally agree with it. I don't believe the 160,000 is over the top. I just wanted to understand how the finances were, because that's what we need to question.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Do you want to go back on that then?
Just if it helps, I think obviously I'm not explaining it well enough. So perhaps afterwards we'll ask Molly to talk us through how the knock-ons work, and you can look at it in more detail if those who want to. Right.
Thanks for that. So we can come back to that issue later then. Okay. So you heard the introduction to the budget precept paper. So. Other questions, members? David, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rob, on page 1217, in paragraph 17, you mentioned we were predicting a budget gap of 4 million. But in paragraph 15, you mentioned that the council tax base has increased and we're going to get an extra 200,000 a year. So can we assume the 4 million is now 3.4?
Generally, what we do for the MTFP is update it in the September, taking into account the budget set in from the previous year. So we don't tend to do a rolling figure, as it were. So 4 million was the last one we produced last year. Yes, as a minimum, it will go down by that 200,000, but I suspect it will be lower than that when we take some of the other items into account as well.
Yes, thank you for that. I think I did, at the introduction to this, I think I did say to you that we have seen this paper, well, not this specific paper, but we've had update paper, I think it was last November, was it? We did. So a lot of this information here, we've seen it before. Right, Sharon, you were next.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a couple of queries on page 11 and then another one on page 27. So page 11, retained firefighters, item 14B. The last sentence, the forecast assumes that exceptionally high amounts of activity do not continue for the remaining months. What happens if it does? Please.
Then we will overspend against that position. But obviously, most of that was relating to the summer period where we had high levels of activity. Clearly, that's already taken into account in the forecast on the assumption that we don't get another prolonged incident such as flooding. Then that's the position that we would expect. But clearly, if we do, then that will be overspent against that position.
Thank you. And F, at the bottom of the page, there's also sort of been a higher demand for legal services provided by Hampshire County Council due to specific activity during the year. Can we have a definition of what the specific activity is, please?
So I think a lot of that may well be to do with the Combined Fire Authority work. That would be the main.
And finally, turning to page 27, Appendix C, the proposed capital programme. We've got retained station replacement programme, sort of in 3 places. I wasn't aware that we actually had a list of which stations were going to be sort of either refurbished or redeveloped or whatever. And are they likely to just be retained stations, or will there be whole-time fire stations? Thank you.
So when we talk, sorry. Yeah, so you'll recall that when we talked in the past about the provisions that we make for capital on an annual basis, it's £3.5 million for vehicle replacement and £450,000 for retained station replacement. So that is just an allocation. What we then do separately through Matt's team is look at the areas where we need to spend that money. So I think that amount sort of rolls up each year until we decide where we wish to spend the money. So at the moment, that's just an allocation. But I assume that will be picked up as part of the wider station investment programme.
We did, as you recall, have a presentation at an APAG meeting from Matt about the station development. Yes.
It concerned me that I just saw.
Yeah, I think Matt can comment on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. As discussed, I think it's an allocation within the budget, but as quite rightly you pointed out, the station investment programme is working through options that have yet to come back to the authority for a decision. So we do not know which retained stations that may be at this point. But that'll come through in a business case through discussions either with APAG and then back to the authority in due course later in the year.
So that is a provision in the budget paper, and it's really important that that's there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard about retained firefighters and retained stations here. Can we make a decision? Are we having retained firefighters, or are we having on-call firefighters and on-call stations, rather than using both terms?
Well, there's confusion nationally on that issue, and I don't know what is the answer. Is there an answer?
I wish there was a simple answer. To be fair, I think our staff are comfortable with either and both. I think that when we come to start to reform our IRMP in later this year, I think we'd want to land our feet down there. So definitely, I mean, your help with that as well, Councillor, would be helpful to corral a view from our staff, because that's what's most important. What do they like to be described as? And we'll put that in our IRMP and reschedule that. I think trying to do it on the hoof here would be difficult, but I do understand at the moment we end up with both descriptions, and it may be perfectly fine maybe, but it's worth us having that conversation with our staff.
Thank you.
David, David, I think you may have been suggesting, shall we make a decision there as one or the other? And now, I'd be quite happy with that, because I've said many times that Hampshire is in the vanguard of reform. But we'd have to consult with the staff, wouldn't we, and decide what they want. So is that something that we should be doing? Can we do that?
Yeah, and I think we've used the IRMP as an opportunity to do that when we start to reform that this year, because it's up for refreshment this financial year. So.
Let's say that we will endeavour to do that as soon as it's possible to do that. Right, where are we going now? Any other questions? If there are no other questions, can I take you to page 21? Now, this is the budget and precept vote, so this should be a named vote, I think, should it not? Do we not need that here? Doesn't apply to us. I think we've done that in the past, but we don't need to. We don't need to do that. Okay, that's fine. Do we need to have a name vote on the budget, on the precept budget recommendation? No. Okay. Well, if it's not a requirement, No. If it's not a requirement, I'm quite content. Right. So, right. Okay. So we don't need that. Right. So can I draw your attention then, please, to page 21, where you've got recommendations from 75 through to 87, and you've got the additional recommendation, which is 88. And where is the recommendation? There it is. And I'll just read that out to you. To approve funding of up to £160,000 from the Transformation Reserve to provide resources to investigate and report on the Ocado fire. Well, you've had enough discussion about that, and I think hopefully you're all content with that additional recommendation. Are you all in favour of these recommendations? Can we all agreed? Thank you. Can that be recorded as unanimous, please? Good. Thank you for that. We now move to page 63 in your agenda, please. Marine incidents, and this is Stu. Where are you, Stu? There you are.
Hello.
Over there. Do you want to introduce this paper, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Morning, members. So the purpose of this paper is for members to consider and declare a position regarding deployment to marine incidents. So there's two specific types of marine incidents: those that are alongside with vessels that are tied up, and those that are at sea. So alongside, we have a duty to respond to those, and we maintain a capability through our firefighters and through the Maintenance of Competence Scheme. At sea is slightly different, where there's no legal duty to respond. However, the Fire Authority can use their powers for fighting fires for life safety. Obviously, with our location, there's a number of risks within the Solent area and within the coastline, and they're set out in paragraphs 16 to 20. And for us, we maintain a capability which is set out in 21 to 24, with a long history of that capability, and it has been tested over a number of years in different incidents. We also work quite closely with partner agencies around the region to make sure that this capability that we have creates a safer solution and an environment for all to work in. It's worth noting that there are some risks for the authority in responding outside of our duty bound area, but it sets out within the paper that there is adequate protection in place to protect the authority. And also worth noting that any decision to deploy is an exec decision from the duty brigade manager or the principal officer on duty, and that's subject to a thorough risk assessment and on a case-by-case basis. So it's not a decision that's just made across the board. So there's a number of options which I'd like to submit to members, and happy to take any questions and consideration of the recommendations which are set out in paragraphs 45 to 47. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Stu, on page 68, 45D, you've got following an in-depth risk assessment. Will you always have time to do an in-depth risk assessment? Emergencies, by their very nature, sometimes require quick decisions. I'm just wondering whether this is an exception or whether we should remove in-depth and just take a risk assessment.
Yeah, I think you're correct on most every emergency. Time is critical. Incidents at sea, interestingly, give us a little bit more time and capacity because of the compartmentation which are within vessels. So the general tactics would be to lock down, that particular area, which does give us a bit of time. The in-depth element to it is obviously the risk to firefighters being deployed at sea. So we would work with the MCA and other agencies to make sure that the risk assessment is absolutely sound and valid before we would put any of our staff at any risk putting them out on a vessel. So it does require a fairly in-depth calculation, really.
Just to add to the point Stu makes there, keep in mind that we have a probably image in our heads of a vessel on fire in the Solent or something. So, you know, this could equally apply to something off the coast of France or out further to sea, you know, the other coasts. And the challenge for us is whether we would deploy or not. So what this paper is asking is if you like, the authority to deploy, but through a brigade manager, take into account all the risks and balance that, you know, the deployment would take in. So sending crews off and not knowing how we'd get them back, for example, would be something we'd really want to consider before we even deployed. So what this paper is doing is giving us as officers the authority to deploy, because the Act allows you to make that decision, but also ensures that we take the right care and responsibility in making that decision that's balanced and reasonable in the circumstances, because there may be some circumstances that we do not deploy. Now, there could be some politics involved in that, of course. You know, the fire service has refused to go and help, but it'll be on a basis of risk to our people, or the likelihood of them being injured or even lost at sea would be, you know, too high in those circumstances. So that's why I think this is really important. We do an in-depth risk assessment of that nature.
Yes, thank you. You can envisage a situation where you might fly crew out to a ship and then it escalates and there's smoke and the helicopter can't take them off. So, yes, it's part of the assessment. Where are we going? Sharon.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 65, point 22, nominated stations close to the coast. Is there can we be provided with a list of those stations that do have that? Because, quite truthfully, I don't know which ones have, and presumably others don't either. So it would be helpful.
Certainly can provide some details. In particular, if the coastal station or the stations around Southampton and Portsmouth, the main two ports are other stations which are covered, and that's a mixture of both retained and whole-time stations. So there is a mix across the board, but I'm happy to collate a list and share that with members.
And also, of course, we have facilities. I know there's equipment retained at Gosport, and that's for inland use, is it not? So marine incidents are not just at sea. They're flooding incidents on rivers inland. So that's part of it.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, Roger.
Thank you. I fully agree with the recommendations. And under D, in the main report, 36D, is maintain a national declared capability. If the government called upon us to provide that capability, would we be reimbursed with any costs involved in that deployment?
I suppose we could ask for it, but whether they came up with anything.
Yeah, so I think in theory, yes. So we could submit our costs to the government. I think that the tracking of costs associated with marine incidents is quite tricky. So I think that the government department, so the Department for Transport, would be the lead organisation trying to deal with the recovery of costs from the vessel, and through those operators and salvors, that could become tricky. So my suggestion would be that we would go through the government rather than we would go directly to recover any costs in that circumstance.
Is that, as I understand it, if the government asks us to deploy USAR, they then pay. Why, if they ask us to deploy in this instance, why should we not have an agreement with them that they pay? I mean, because we are providing a major resource to the government for national emergency at sea. Yeah. And I see it the same.
So let me, because it's a little bit more delicate, that one. The formal line from DFT on the matter of firefighting at sea is that the fire rescue service is not required. Because ships' crews, salvors, that's the national model for recovery. Now, we know in our experience that port authorities are much more comfortable deploying in our sense, the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service teams to go and survey a ship and make sure it's fit and suitable to be alongside, so that a fire can be fought if necessary by our crews alongside, because that changes the definition of being at sea. So we do get deployed like that. So the actual practice is to mobilise FRSs. And we assist the harbour master in that regard. But the current national policy from government is it's not required. So NFCC is working hard at that and putting some lobbying in place. Now, the NFCC lead for maritime incidents is changing, and let's say maybe coming closer to home. That'll be our test. So, if you can still hear me, that will give us the opportunity to influence a bit more at national level our dilemma. So that is our hope in time that we'll be funded for it. But for us, the cost is relatively minimal compared to, it was like a chorus, that wasn't it? But relatively minimal compared to the costs we have to bear anyway, being a coastal service. So we can extend our firefighting alongside capability into the firefighting at sea if we needed to. But this is about the surveying a ship to make sure it's safe to be alongside. So I think funding is always useful, but it's not the material case which would make this doable otherwise. So I think it's just one of those things of giving government contract to say, do it please. It's always much cleaner. The Fire and Rescue Services Act allows us to do this, but it's up to you as a fire authority whether you want us to do it or not. And we could de-declare and we're not going to do it anymore, but I think given our nature of our coastline, I think that would be a backward step.
And of course, I said earlier on that we like to keep Hampshire in the vanguard of reform, and here we are in Hampshire with the two big carriers in Portsmouth, the biggest, well, some of the biggest cruise ships that we've got in this country, in Southampton, and indeed Portsmouth is wanting to get more cruise ships into their port, aren't they? And the Solent is the busiest waterway in this country. So it is surely appropriate that we should be taking the action that is recommended here. Jason.
Oh gosh, sorry, that's wrong time to burp, wasn't it? Sorry, okay. Page 65.23, a somewhat parochial point really, considering I come from Portsmouth and we're an island. But just out of pure personal curiosity, you've mentioned that we've got a maritime response team. How many firefighters do we have within that team? Purely.
So currently we have, so we recruited up to 50 and trained 50. Over a period of time, that's dwindled down, so we have slightly less than that. Part of that team, and the reason why that's reduced down, is part of that team is for assessment. You know, to make sure that the vessel's safe. Part of it was for firefighting, and we've reduced that capability. So the intention is more for the assessment side of things.
Okay, I mean, thank you for the answer. You didn't quite give the answer though, but you reduced by how many? Am I allowed to know?
So I think the current is 30. I think it's 38, but I can check the actual number that we've still got on call available to respond to that incident.
Last point. So there were 50. So are we going back up to 50 again at some point, or are you happy with the 38 that we have?
No. So happy with the numbers, and because they're completing a specific job, which is different to the capability that we had in the past.
And of course, if you're deploying firefighters to an incident at sea, there are on-board firefighters as well, aren't there, that you will be liaising with and working with. Right. Anybody else got any points that they wish to raise on this item? Yes?
Mr. Chairman, just out of interest more than anything, is that we have the fort in the Solent, which actually is a hotel. How would we deploy to that fort? And secondly, is that because it's a hotel and it's accommodation, does our 880 still kick in on that or not? Because the chance of actually achieving it is actually extremely remote.
Well, we have actually deployed to. We've deployed to the forts, haven't we? You've gone there for actual fires and for exercise purposes. I think. Have you not? I think so. So. Yeah.
So the forts are fairly unique. They're council taxpayer. They pay council tax to Portsmouth City Council, so they're actually on the land. So they're considered to be the land. So we have a duty to respond to those. So we've trained, and the point that Councillor Mintoff makes about the coastal stations, those stations would deploy on a vessel, and then they would then transfer from that vessel to the hotel, much the same as anyone that visits those hotels would transfer. So we have arrangements in place and training in place for us to be able to deploy out to those forts.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for your input there. Some useful questions. So, can I take you to page 68 and the recommendations there? Are you agreed with those? Thank you. So now moving on to agenda item 9, please. Page 69. Fire safety advice policy position, and this is Chief Fire Officer, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, the Chairman's already mentioned about being at the vanguard of change across the English and UK Fire and Rescue Service. Now, this is a question today which I'm certain that not many other fire authorities have considered. And I want to take you to the paragraph 6, which outlines the current legislation within the Fire and Rescue Services Act, and in particular paragraph 6b, which talks about the thing which, A is what we must do. The Fire and Rescue Authority must make provision for the purposes of promoting fire safety. So that's a pretty universal and encapsulating statement. Then it goes on to say the extent to which you consider it reasonable to do so. Now, we've never reached a determination, and I'm not aware of any other fire and rescue authority that's reached a determination in what it's reasonable to do so. And yet, practice every day means that fire and rescue services, officers of the fire and rescue service, can carry out that judgment. What's reasonable to do for nothing, what we're not going to do because that's not our job. And officers are having to make that decision every day, but without policy guidance. So we bring it here in a way, but it's a matter of tidying up our current approach. Equally, though, and not wanting to avoid the issue, anything which we do not provide free of charge, so you decide that it's reasonable to do this or that free of charge, everything outside of that, therefore, means that the Fire Authority can charge for it. That's the connection. So this paper doesn't intend to deal with how you charge for it or what who you charge. It's simply a matter of to what extent does this Fire Authority wants to give to the public free of charge a certain level of service which it deems reasonable to do so. So, if I take you to over the page to paragraph 9, where we start to describe the two different types of property that the Fire and Rescue Service and Authority has a responsibility to look after. First of all, we describe domestic premises, which you'll know from our previous IRMP is where people in our community are most at risk. The people most likely to die from fire in our community live in domestic premises. So people always ask me when I go out and about talking about Hampshire, and they say, what's your biggest risk? And I say people's homes. That's our biggest risk because that's where people die in the main. There are some pretty big, significant places which, if they were to have a fire, would be, importantly, it would be hazardous, but they don't catch fire, and their likelihood is quite low. Whereas homes are much higher likelihood, and people do die in them. So we describe in here the types of people that we feel absolutely the Fire Authority should be giving free of charge advice, intervention from your officers to make sure that people are made safer in their homes. And we describe the levels of that in this paper, from a visit, safe and well visit, right through to access to a website where you can get good advice and good guidance on what you should do to keep you and your family safe. So that's pretty clear cut at this stage. When it comes to non-domestic premises, again, a non-domestic premise can range from someone running a small affair, a small shop selling jam, right through to the likes of Ocado, even the very large industrial premises where they have responsibilities under the Regulatory Reform Order. Both those places have responsibilities under that order. And as an authority, you are the enforcing authority for that order, which deals with fire safety. So clearly, we have a duty and a role to play in that regard. But what we do, and the suggestion in this paper is that responsible persons who have a duty to do certain things under that order can ask for advice at any stage, and we'll give that free of charge. So it's their responsibility as the person employed by that commercial premises to do the things they have to do under that order. It is not the Fire and Rescue Service responsibility. So the Fire and Rescue Services took this to the extent that we decided as an authority it would be good, wouldn't it, to do their fire risk assessment for them. You could do that. We could become the responsible person in a sense, doing the fire risk assessment for them, but we end up carrying a great deal of risk in terms of doing that risk assessment for them. So the Act is very clear about who's responsible. So you can see there's a kind of continuum here about to what extent we offer free advice and when does advice finish and doing something which the law requires, a risk assessment, start. And that line is a bit blurry, I think it's fair to say. Well, what is a risk assessment and what is advice? So this paper just attempts at least to lay out a definition for you so you can draw a line in what you think is reasonable to offer to our community in a way of free support for fire safety. And that spectrum is best described by the nature of giving everyone advice, everyone who could possibly think of. You just give them free advice and go and do the risk assessments for them, right through to we don't help anybody because we don't think it's reasonable to do so. So that's the kind of size of the spectrum. Clearly, neither of those positions is right and is therefore tenable. So what we try to do here is lay out what we think are the suggested positions. So probably best to go to the recommendations to kind of bring those to life. Paragraph 40 says that the specific and targeted advice for those most vulnerable in their home is approved by Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority as what is reasonable to provide under the scope of its duty. So that talks about the most vulnerable and people in domestic buildings. I think that's a bit clearer. 41 is the more delicate one, and secondly, so the option A is approved by Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority as what is reasonable to provide within the scope of its duty for non-domestic. And so let's go back to option A, which is on paragraph 32. That talks about advice on request with regards to fire safety and means of escape in the form of web-based information and linked to emergency government documentation, focused workshops, telephone advice through campaigns. So that gives you some scope of the things we'll give free of charge to commerce to make sure they're complying with the law. B goes a bit further and says about we'll do fire risk assessments, which we're not recommending is our position. So I appreciate it's a bit clunky, this particular trying to position this quite complex issue around the law, but I think what captures it particularly well is the fire safety advice, the position statement which we're asking you to adopt, which I hope you get a chance to read, which describes in detail for those customers that want to know what they can get for free and what they can't. We'll place this on our website so they can understand what they get and what they can demand from us, but most importantly what they can't get, and the fire authority may reserve the right to charge for it if it was requested. That's the quite important part of this paper. Hopefully I've made it as clear as I can, albeit it's quite complex in terms of where that line is drawn, but hopefully you can infer from the language that we've used, the definition needs to be clear and accessible for those who may try to contact us and say, can I have this service from you? Our officers can then go back to your position statement and say, yes you can, or no you can't. We can then set other policies around what we charge for, what we don't charge for, what we do, how we plan our resourcing around this statement also. At that point, I'll pause for questions in case either you're utterly lost or I'm teaching you to suck eggs.
Thank you for that, Neil. Perhaps I should have said at the end, well, if you go to paragraph 21 on page 71, it says there, this report follows 2 presentations at APAG. Now, I do recall at APAG, I recorded the fact that I am chairman and myself and Roger Price are directors of 3S Fire. I have advice from legal officer Paul Hodgson that as we're not paid directors, we don't have a pecuniary interest. But having recorded at APAG, well, at least I did, I think you did also, Roger, that we are directors of 3S Fire, and so that gives us a personal interest, I suppose. So I think it's probably appropriate that that should be recorded. You agree? Well, I think having had it recorded at the APAG meetings, which are mentioned here, I think that probably should be recorded, that we are the two authority members who are directors of 3S Fire. You've heard Neil's presentation on this report. So, questions, members? Any comments, questions? Oh, Sharon, you were asking. Yes, sorry.
Yes, it's sort of incidental to this. On page 70, we've got domestic premises and non-domestic premises. Southampton and Portsmouth are probably the only areas where this would be relevant. Student halls of residences, do you class them as domestic or non-domestic? Because they are quite a high risk.
That's a very good question.
So,
the simple fact that they're part of a commercial concern, like a hotel, the difficulty comes around blocks of flats, which are private domestic dwellings. That's slightly different because the order only applies to the common areas, whereas in halls of residence, because it's a commercial concern, it's slightly different. So we would take a view that they are commercial in nature, but as you'll know, the housing supplier or the buildings, the responsible person still needs to be designated, and the city council has one, as do the private landlords that exist there. So we will regulate through them. So that's how they'll be treated. I think I might say, Stuart.
So it's actually not just Southampton and Portsmouth, is it? Because if we go to Winchester, driving into Winchester, you've got a university there, you've got students all over the place, but you've got Winchester College, and we see the students every day, and they're just living in these buildings there. They're just ordinary buildings, some of them, but they're not private buildings. Oh, Liz, yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's a moot point really, but if the fire service is providing courses for, say, the responsibilities of the responsible person and that, why isn't 3S Fire doing it and making money out of it for us? Because presumably what 3S Fire can charge and what the fire service can recover in costs is slightly different.
So in a sense, that strikes at the heart of this paper, in as much as what does the Fire Authority regard as reasonable to give free of charge, and our kind of, if you like, public duties, and to what extent does it draw the line. And I've not gone too close into, therefore, what can be charged, because everything other than you describe as we give for free, by definition, is chargeable. The mechanism in which we or some other body charges, that's entirely a different conversation, which we'll have at some other point. But I think you do strike at the heart of this particular paper. We want to be clear about the things that you're saying. We should do this for nothing, because it's a public duty. It's what we're funded for to do, and including helping people understand their duties under the Act. We think that's part of our recommendation to you, is we think that's part of our public duty. To be really, really good at it, that's a whole different kettle of fish. To learn how to do risk assessments, that's a different kettle of fish. But to understand your duties under the Act that we enforce, we think that's a viable and sensible moral role for us to carry out.
Right. Thank you. So the recommendations are on page 73 and 74. Everybody content with those?
74, just to be accurate, I think the option, in 41, it should say the option 32A, because it indicates which is the paragraph it relates to.
Option 32A, yes. Option A, yeah, well, that is, thank you for that, that is a valid point. So can we amend that? Katie, put 32 in there, can you please? Yes, thank you. So you all agreed? Okay, thank you. Right, so moving on to the next paper. Where are we? Page 10. Who's presenting this one? This is you, Stu, again. Page 77, please. Blue light collaboration.
Thank you, Chairman. So, Blue Light Collaboration, we've worked really well with the emergency services in Hampshire for many years, and good long-standing examples include this building, the shared estates across fire stations, our co-responder scheme, which we've heard about in the past, and Arson Task Force, just to give you a few examples. There is a legal backdrop with this, so there is a duty placed upon us under the Police and Crime Act, which is to keep collaboration under review amongst the emergency services. And really the purpose of this paper is to give you members an update of the current work across the emergency services in Hampshire, following a commitment I made a number of months ago at a previous meeting. So the breadth and depth of work really is varied across the board. And what we do is we govern this internally. So we have a Blue Light Executive board, which myself I sit on, with a colleague from ambulance and the police, and we track progress, we manage the risks, and we seek new opportunities to create better, more effective and more efficient outcomes for us. My proposal is that I'm not going to go through all of the individual projects which you can see, which give you an update, but just to pick out a couple of themes. So in terms of some of our responding activity, so it mentioned in paragraph 12 gaining entry, and then in paragraph 14 about non-injury falls. That's a response activity that the fire service undertake for the purpose of responding to vulnerable people. And this is where the allegiance, if you like, to some of our community safety comes in, because it's a fairly straightforward response role, but actually for us it gets us into the homes and the lives of those most vulnerable. So those that can't get to a door to open a door, and those people that have fallen and can't get up. So actually for us it serves our community safety agenda really well. So there's an additional benefit to the members of the public, not just from getting a faster response from the fire service, but also from our ability to then look after those people, to deliver a safe and well visit and make sure that they're safer in their homes. There's a number of projects which are looking at aligning our capabilities, so areas such as TRIM, which is our instant debrief protocol, our use of volunteers, and the community safety work that we do on a wider sense. Both our ambulance and police colleagues share those goals, and what we try and do is we try and work together to produce better outcomes and more efficient outcomes within those. So effectively what we're trying to do is provide more effective solutions, more efficient solutions across the board, and for us to be more resilient as emergency services for the safety of public. And I think that sits really well with our core mission. So the conclusion, this paper just sets out an update, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have about any particular projects within there. Thank you.
I note what you say about non-injury falls. An injury fall is somebody contacting 999 and getting the ambulance. So how are we tasked? How do you know that somebody... I mean, how do those people contact us and say, I've fallen over and I can't get up, or whatever it is?
So this is generally frail or elderly people that have fallen, and what they physically just aren't able to have the strength to be able to lift themselves and put themselves back into a chair. So generally speaking, that will go through either a 999 call to the ambulance, or through... Yeah, or through a care provider who monitor that person, and they're able to contact them. So we're now attending in certain locations those calls on behalf of the ambulance, where we can make a faster response and use our capability in terms of manual handling to create a better outcome.
So it's a controlled assessment then?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. I think the report is a very interesting report, giving us lots of information and detail which is actually going on, and the work that looking to the future. But the thing which actually really staggered me is in paragraph 11b on page 78, that 40% of co-responding calls, we do 40% of co-responding calls across the UK. Now, I think that is a staggering percentage when you consider the number of fire stations across the country, and with our 51 stations, we're doing 40% of all the calls. It really puts and shows how well our firefighters have grasped the nettle and are dealing with and making people much safer in Hampshire than in any other county in the country.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. There was a meeting of HFRA Standards and Governance Committee held on the 31st of January. Can I just invite members, and I hope you've already received a notice meeting, to a meeting next Wednesday, 9:15, where we're looking at the plan for dealing with the inspector's report, our action plan. Thank you, Councillor Glenn. Is everyone happy with the minutes? Oh, yeah.
All agreed?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just to read. I'm not quite sure where we are within that time scale, but I think it's running down. I did say earlier on that Councillor Hopley is unable to be with us today, but hopefully he will be, because he's in every meeting. So hopefully he'll be there. So the rest of you are able to be there and listen to the discussion. I think that would be really useful. Right. That concludes our meeting. So thank you very much for your attendance today. It was our first meeting here in room X. If you've got any other feedback on the use of the facilities, I think those
That thing go up at 10:30 every day.
11:30.
That's just when we have full council meetings, especially here.
Right, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.